Out in the high desert, the wind doesn't just blow, it carries voices from places that don't exist. I went looking for solitude in the vast emptiness of the dunes, but I quickly realized that in a place where you can see for miles, there is nowhere to hide from something that doesn't want to be seen. I have always been a creature of the silence. While most people find the absolute isolation of the desert terrifying, I found it medicinal. There is a specific kind of peace that exists in the high desert of the Southwest, a place where the stars feel close enough to touch and the only clock that matters is the movement of the sun. For my annual solo camping trip, I chose a spot that was truly off the grid, a solid 3-hour drive from the nearest paved road, tucked away in a valley of shifting sand and ancient rock formations. I was driving my old, reliable camper van, stocked with enough water and supplies to last me a week of total disconnection from the digital world. The drive-in was a test of endurance. The road was little more than a suggestion of a trail, a winding path of deep sand and jagged stones that rattled the very frame of my van. By the time I reached my chosen campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. I parked near a cluster of towering sandstone pillars that looked like frozen giants guarding the valley. There was no cell service, no radio signal, and not another human being for at least 50 miles. It was exactly what I had prayed for. I spent the first few hours setting up my camp in the fatting light. I rolled out my rug, set up my foldable chair, and started a small, controlled fire using sagebrush and mesquite. The smell was intoxicating, earthy, sharp, and ancient. As the darkness solidified around me, the desert transformed. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a biting chill that made the fire feel like a lifeline. I sat there, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the Milky Way stretch across the sky like a bridge of diamonds. The silence was so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. It was around midnight when the silence broke. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the stillness of the desert, it sounded like a thunderclap. It was the sound of a stone hitting a metal surface. Clang, I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound had come from the back of my van. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the crackle of my fire. 5 minutes passed, nothing. I tried to rationalize it, a temperature change causing the metal to pop, or perhaps a small pebble falling from the sandstone pillars above. I took a deep breath and relaxed. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't the erratic, light scuffs of a coyote or a kit fox. These were heavy, deliberate, and bipedal. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was walking through the dry scrub brush just beyond the circle of my firelight. My blood turned to ice. I reached for my heavy-duty tactical flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the darkness. The light cut through the night, illuminating the twisted shapes of cacti and the red dust of the desert floor. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness. The footsteps stopped instantly. I held the light steady on a patch of greasewood bushes where I thought the sound had originated. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, slowly, a man stepped into the very edge of the light. He was dressed entirely in dark, dusty clothing that seemed to blend perfectly with the desert floor. He didn't have a backpack, a water bottle, or a flashlight of his own. He was just standing there, roughly 20 feet away, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He looked like he had walked out of the earth itself. His face was weathered and gaunt, his eyes reflecting the beam of my light like a cat's. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low and raspy like sandpaper on stone. "I saw your fire from my camp. It's a cold night." I didn't lower the light. My survival instincts were screaming at me. There were no other camps in this valley. I had scouted the entire perimeter before sunset. To see a fire from his camp, he would have had to be miles away or he was lying. "Where is your camp?" I asked, my hand moving toward the heavy iron fire poker I had left by my chair. He pointed vaguely into the darkness behind him, toward the deepest part of the canyon where the shadows were absolute. "Just over the ridge," he replied. He didn't move any closer, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, staring at me with a terrifyingly blank expression, his silhouette framed by the ancient rocks. The desert silence returned, but this time it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a trap that had just snapped shut. The man's presence was like a glitch in the desert's vast, natural order. In a place where you can hear a coyote yip from 3 miles away, he had managed to stand 20 feet from my fire without a sound until he chose to be heard. The raspy quality of his voice suggested he hadn't spoken to anyone in a very long time, or perhaps that he was imitating the sound of a voice rather than using one. He stood perfectly still, his dusty clothes hanging off his gaunt frame like rags on a scarecrow. I kept my grip tight on the heavy iron fire poker, the cold metal biting into my palm. I didn't lower my flashlight. "If your camp is just over the ridge, you should probably head back," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "It's dangerous to wander the dunes at night without a light. You could fall into a wash or stumble into a nest of rattlers. He didn't blink, he didn't even squint against the high-powered beam of my LED light, he just stared through it as if his eyes didn't perceive the glare. "I don't need a light," he whispered. "The desert speaks to those who listen. I heard you coming hours ago. The van, it makes a lot of noise, it disturbs the sand." A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air traveled down my spine. The way he spoke about the sand, as if it were a living thing that could be offended, was deeply unsettling. I took a half step back toward the open side door of my van. My mind was racing, calculating how long it would take to throw my chair inside and jump into the driver's seat. "Well, I'm turning in for the night," I lied, hoping he would take the hint and vanish back into the shadows. "Good night." Instead of leaving, he took a step forward. It was a slow, deliberate movement, his boots making a heavy, crunching sound in the crusty desert soil. "You look uneasy," he said, and for the first time a small, tight smile twitched at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a friendly expression, it was the look of someone watching an animal struggle in a trap. "I can tell you don't believe me about my camp, why don't you come with me? It's just right over there, I have things to show you, things the desert has hidden for a long time." "No," I said instantly, "I'm staying here." He stopped moving, but he didn't retreat. He stood at the very edge of the fire's glow, half of his body submerged in shadow, the other half lit by the flickering orange flames. He looked like a statue carved from the red sandstone itself. "The solitude you're looking for, you won't find it by sitting near a fire," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. "Real solitude is in the deep places, below the sand, where the wind can't find you." The hair on my arm stood up. This wasn't just a drifter, this was someone who had lost their mind to the heat and the emptiness, or something far worse. I realized that the iron poker in my hand wouldn't do much against a man who seemed to feel no pain or fear. I needed to leave. Now. I said no, get off my sight, I barked, trying to project a dominance I didn't feel. He nodded slowly as if he expected my refusal. He looked down at the ground, then back up at me, his eyes wide and vacant. "As you wish, but the desert doesn't like to be ignored. You brought your lights and your metal and your noise. You think you're alone, but you're never alone out here." He turned around without another word and walked back into the darkness. I kept my flashlight on him until the beam could no longer reach his retreating form. I waited, straining my ears, listening for the sound of his footsteps. They faded quickly, leaving only the oppressive, ringing silence of the valley. I didn't wait a single second longer. I didn't care about the rug, the expensive foldable chair, or the sagebrush fire that was still burning. I threw the iron poker into the van, scrambled into the driver's seat, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so hard I had to use both of them to turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a violent intrusion into the desert night. I slammed the van into gear and cut the steering wheel hard to pull a U-turn. As the van swung around, my powerful off-road headlights swept across the area where the man had disappeared. For a brief, terrifying second, the light illuminated the sandstone pillars I had been camping near. He was still there. He hadn't walked over the ridge. He was standing directly behind the pillar nearest to my van, pressed against the rock as if he were trying to merge with it. But he wasn't alone anymore. In the flash of the headlights, I saw him holding something, a long, jagged piece of rusted metal that looked like an old farm implement or a primitive blade. And standing just behind him, barely visible in the periphery of the light, were two other figures dressed in the same dusty rags, their eyes reflecting the light like a pack of wolves. I floored the gas. The van fishtailed in the soft sand, the engine screaming as the tires fought for traction. I didn't look back. I drove through the darkness, bouncing over rocks and through dry washes, pushing the old van to its absolute limit. I didn't stop until I hit the paved highway 3 hours later. Even under the bright lights of a gas station, surrounded by other travelers, I couldn't stop looking at the shadows beyond the pumps. I realized then that I hadn't gone to the desert to find silence. I had gone there to be noticed by things that thrive in the quiet. The neon buzz of the gas station on the edge of the interstate felt like a shield. I stood by my van, bathed in the harsh artificial white light, watching the other travelers go about their mundane lives. A family was arguing about snacks, a trucker was cleaning his windshield. To them, the night was just a period of travel. To me, the night had become a living entity that had tried to swallow me whole. I looked at the side of my van, and in the bright light I saw the mark, a long, jagged scratch in the metal near the rear door, right where the first asterisk clang had come from. It wasn't a rock chip. It was a deliberate gouge, as if someone had tried to peel back the skin of the vehicle. I drove the remaining hours home in a trance, the sun rising over the suburbs like a promise of safety. But the safety was an illusion. When I finally parked in my driveway and began to unload the chaotic mess I had shoved into the back of the van, I found something that made the desert heat return to my blood. Tucked inside the folds of my rolled-up outdoor rug was a handful of red desert sand and a small, weathered bone, a coyote's jaw bleached white by the sun. It hadn't been there when I packed. Someone had slipped it into my gear while I was sitting by the fire, watching the man in the light. They had been that close. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a different kind of isolation. I stopped going to the desert, but the desert began to manifest in my daily life. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of a stone hitting my bedroom window, asterisk tink 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 asterisk, and when I looked out the street would be empty, save for a light dusting of red sand on the sill. I began to see people in the city who shared that same gaunt, weathered look, people who stood a little too still in the shadows of alleys, their eyes reflecting the streetlights like nocturnal animals. I tried to talk to a friend about it, a fellow hiker who spent his life in the backcountry. He listened with a grim expression, and when I finished, he didn't tell me I was crazy. He told me about the old ones of the high desert, not ghosts, but people who had walked so far into the emptiness that they had forgot how to be human. They weren't looking for money or food, they were looking for company. They were looking for others to join the silence. He told me that once you make eye contact with them, you become a part of their map. The final blow came when I finally decided to sell the van. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. It felt like a monument to my near-death experience. A young couple came to look at it, excited for their own adventures. As they were inspecting the interior, the man pulled something out from the deep crevice between the driver's seat and the center console. "Hey, did you lose this?" he asked, handing me a small, folded piece of dusty paper. I opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't paper. It was a scrap of old, sun-bleached denim, the same fabric the man in the desert had been wearing. Scrawled on it in what looked like charcoal was a crude map of the valley where I had camped. In the center of the map, where my van had been parked, was a single, stylized drawing of an eye. And underneath it, in shaky, rhythmic handwriting that looked like it had been carved into the fabric, were 4 words: "We hear YOU breathing." I didn't sell them the van. I took it to a scrapyard that afternoon and watched as the heavy machinery crushed it into a cube of twisted metal. I thought that would be the end of it. But that night, as I lay in my bed in the heart of the city, miles away from the dunes and the sandstone pillars, the wind began to howl through the vents. It didn't sound like a storm. It sounded like a low, raspy hum, a rhythmic vibration that mimicked the sound of footsteps on dry, crusty soil. I realized then that the man hadn't been inviting me to his camp. He had been marking me as part of his own. The high desert is a place of infinite memory where nothing ever truly disappears. I am back in the world of lights and noise, but every time I step on a patch of dry dirt or feel a sudden chill in the air, I am back in that valley. I am still sitting by that fire, and the figures are still standing just behind the rocks, waiting for the fire to go out. Because the desert doesn't just want your body, it wants your silence, and eventually the silence always wins.